So, good evening, all of you, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution in this, our anniversary year from 1824. And tonight we have Robert Morrison, who is the author of 2 prize-winning books, Regency Years and the biography of DeQuincy. And he has been with us to speak at least 3 times. Right, the first, right. Yes. So he spoke on Thomas DeQuincy and the Dreams of Somerset, The Women of the Regency, A Revolution Almost Beyond Expression, and he was the keynote speaker of our Bath Gothic Fiction Symposium on the topic of the appeal of the Gothic. In addition, he's done 2 videos for us. One on food of the Regency, one Christmas. And then the next Christmas, he did Christmas in the Regency with John Stratton, right? So we are very grateful to him, and we are very fortunate to have him this evening because he's going to return to Canada. And we will be sad. But we wish him well. And tonight he's going to talk about the letters of DeQuincy. Could we please welcome Robert Morrison?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a great honor for me to speak at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution a couple of previous times. And it's a great honor for me to have so many people here and people from Bath Spa who have made my time here so immensely rewarding and rich. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you to my Bath Spa colleagues especially. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Thomas DeQuincy. There's a shock. I'm going to talk about DeQuincy. But I hope I say something of interest, and I hope that I give you a sense of the project I've been pursuing over the past 5 years. So this is about archives and autobiography and the literature of addiction. So I want to thank, forgive me for all these thank yous, the British Academy, who have supported me over the past 5 years very generously. And I want to thank again Bath Spa, which is the best place to work that I know. So I'm going to talk about, there's only 3 boxes here, and I've got 4 topics. So I've squeezed one in under the Wordsworthian general preamble, and then I'll talk about the other 3. So the general preamble is about DeQuincy and letters, and the challenges and the rewards of producing an edition entirely from manuscript. I've produced lots of editions, but I never produced one that is all manuscript writing, and that poses some pretty serious challenges and lots of exhilaration as well. And then I'll move to what is a letter. Before I began this project, I was pretty sure I knew exactly what a letter was. Now I don't really think I do know what a letter is, and I hope that you can give me some guidance on that. Then I want to read a DeQuincy letter and just try to present to you some of the challenges of picking up a piece of paper that's 200 years old with Thomas DeQuincy scrawling all over it with abbreviations and stains and all the rest of it, and trying to decipher what he is saying. And finally, then I want to move to the literature of addiction and DeQuincy's role in the literature of addiction and what is emerging from the letters, which is quite a strikingly different narrative than what DeQuincy tells in the published version. I want to add, too, that my wife, Carol, who is here, has been my partner in this entire production, although she prefers the term voluntary research assistant. But to me, she's my partner and an immense help, and she reads DeQuincy's hand better than I do now, so I'm very grateful to her as well. Okay, I'm going to start literature, literary form, and letters. So I wanted to begin here because the first letter we have that DeQuincy wrote was written not very far from here. It was written to his elder sister, Mary, as you can see on the top right-hand corner, March 12, 1799. This is DeQuincy's hand when he is 14 years old, and it's pretty legible. And you can see that he has written it from Bath, and it's to my dear sister. And he is writing from Green Park Buildings East, number 6, Tuesday morning, March 12th, 1799. DeQuincy's association with Bath, which is, I talked about when Betty first asked me if I could give a talk, I thought, I think I could talk about DeQuincy in Somerset. I think I'd talk about DeQuincy in Bath. He was a student at Bath Grammar School. When you walk up Broad Street, on the left-hand side as you're going up, there's the old grammar school. That's where DeQuincy attended from 1796 until 1799. And it played an immensely important role in his development. He was a brilliant classicist, DeQuincy, and he had a master there from Eton named Nathaniel Morgan. And DeQuincy said, every one of my schoolmasters was a dunce, except Nathaniel Morgan. Nathaniel Morgan knew what he was about. But as DeQuincy's mother was a very strong evangelical woman, and when Nathaniel Morgan praised DeQuincy to the sky because of his gifts as a classicist and as a critic, Mrs. DeQuincy took him out of school and moved him to school in Wiltshire, because she could not tolerate the notion that someone would fill her son's head with the notion that he was talented. And so in some ways, DeQuincy spends his entire career crawling back from that. So this is the Oxford Handbook of British Romantic Prose, which I published a couple of weeks ago. And there's a wonderful chapter in it on sports writing by John Strachan, and a wonderful chapter in it on music by Jane Moore. And I wrote a chapter for it, and another good friend, Thomas Richardson, wrote a chapter on letter writing. And this chapter on letter writing, he articulates letters as a literary form and the value of letters as a literary form. So letter writing in DeQuincy's age was, as Thomas Richardson has recently observed, quote, the only viable alternative to face-to-face engagement. But for the authors of the age, the letter was also another meaningful form of literary art. And then Tom goes on to add, this is Jane Welsh Carlyle, the personal letter, Tom continues, also captured the voice of the author. And importantly, for those writers who did not achieve literary attention in another genre, such as Jane Welsh Carlyle or Sophia Scott Lockhart, Walter Scott's daughter, the letter is their only enduring voice. I think that's a very poignant way of thinking of people that we only know via letters. And when I began my career, letters were what you used to get to the heart of Keats's poetry. Now letters are considered much more important as an independent literary form in and of themselves. And in the case of women writers, that has done a tremendous amount of good by giving them credibility for writing some of the most marvelous letters in the language. And that certainly applies to Jane Welsh Carlyle. Jane Welsh Carlyle was, of course, married to this man, Thomas Carlyle. Jane Welsh's husband, Thomas Carlyle, was, like her, an inveterate letter writer. The Edinburgh University started producing the letters of Thomas Carlyle in 1970, and they finished in 2022. So it was 52 years, and they produced 50 volumes. And it is the most astonishing project, and it is completed. I was a PhD student at Edinburgh in the late 1980s, and my internal examiner was one of the key people on the edition. And I remember hearing him talk about getting the letters moving. And it was my first exposure to the task of editing manuscripts and editing manuscript letters, especially. Carlyle is, of course, a product of the University of Edinburgh. So he was an inveterate letter writer, but like other prominent literary men, including DeQuincy, Carlyle's voice also endures in his published writing, where he often explores the importance of letters. In other words, he's a letter writer who theorizes about the importance of writing letters. And my favorite spot he does that is in his edition of Cromwell's Letters and Speeches, where Carlyle characterizes the value of letters for insights into their author. And this is what Carlyle says. And this is in Carlyle's sort of unmissable style, but there is something remarkable about it. And these words have gone through my head, and I think Carol's head several times as we have sat there with an autographed letter of DeQuincy's that we're quite sure nobody's read for 200 years. And there's sort of an exhilaration about reading a letter that you don't think's been read for 200 years, but you also sit there going, am I at the forefront of literary scholarship here? Or am I looking at stuff that nobody knows, nobody's felt any urgency to see for 200 years? And I haven't quite decided on that. But this is Carlyle talking about letters. That autograph letter, that piece of manuscript that we're holding, it was once all luminous as a burning beacon, every word of it a live coal in its time. It was once a piece of the general fire and light of human life, that letter. Neither is it yet entirely extinct. Well read, there is still in it light enough to exhibit its own self, nay, to diffuse a faint, authentic twilight some distance round it. By degrees, the combined small twilights may produce a kind of general feeble twilight, rendering the past credible, the ghosts of the past and some glimpses of them visible. Such is the effect of contemporary letters always. I've held that in my head a lot as we've looked at these letters, and I hope as we found letters and gather letters, we're getting kind of a faint but authentic twilight of what DeQuincy's life, the shape of DeQuincy's life. One of Carlyle's own letters is to DeQuincy at the peak of their very brief, and I would say rather unexpected friendship in the late 1820s. Many of you will know that in 1802, an Edinburgh reviewer, Francis Jeffrey, coined the term the Lake School as a way of deriding and dismissing William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Robert Southey. And the notion that they were school was picked up in 1817 by Blackwood's magazine, who coined the Cockney School to mock especially John Keats and Leigh Hunt. And so this is Carlyle writing to DeQuincy in 1828 and suggesting that he and DeQuincy formed their own school, which he would call the Bog School. Carlyle is writing from Craigenputtock, and he says to DeQuincy, "Would you come hither and be king over us?" He wrote to DeQuincy from Craigenputtock in December 1828. Then indeed we had made a fair beginning, and the Bog School might snap its fingers at the Lake School itself and hope to be one day recognized of all men. Carlyle went on to become one of the most important literary figures of the 19th century, and he and Jane are widely recognized as two of its most important letter writers. DeQuincy achieved nowhere near the fame of Carlyle, but his literary reputation has been on the rise for several decades. DeQuincy is best known, this is Carlyle looking sunny as ever, as you can see. DeQuincy is best known for his Confessions of an English Opium-Eater. The work tempted many then and now to experiment with opium, but it did not tempt Carlyle. Better, 1,000 times better die than have anything to do with such a devil's own drug, Carlyle exclaimed after reading DeQuincy's Confessions. DeQuincy is also celebrated for his satiric essays on murder, considered as one of the fine arts, and for his vivid accounts of contemporaries such as the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a fellow metaphysician, a fellow fell-walker, magazinist, intense admirer of Wordsworth, and of course, most notoriously, a fellow opium addict. There is still no collected edition of DeQuincy's letters, however, and the vast majority of them remain unpublished. My edition of the letters of DeQuincy is forthcoming in 2. John Strachan keeps saying to me, it's not going to be 2, it's going to be 3. I haven't told OEP yet, but that may happen. 3 volumes from Oxford University Press. At the beginning of the project, that is 2019, when I arrived in Bath, I thought there were roughly 800 extant DeQuincy letters. That was the best information that we had. That wasn't true. Of these 800 extant letters, 19th and 20th century sources had published just over 2 of them in full, and a selection of another 100 of them. So that left, when I arrived in Bath, 500 DeQuincy letters that had never been published, and another 100 that had only been published, that had never been published in full. This is, of course, Bath Grammar School, a few blocks over there. In the past 4 years, however, all sorts of new information has come to light. The project is meant to be getting smaller, and some days I come home, or we come home, and it's bigger. This is because so far I have located about 300 DeQuincy letters that I knew nothing about when the project began. So that's very exciting. And then you come home and you go, oh my God, that's very exciting, because I don't find them all in the UK. Some of them are in Australia, loads of them are in America, one of them is in Canada. And I want to see these letters. So it presents challenges, and it's also super, I don't want to be too much like a nerd, but it's super, super cool when you write off and they say to the State Library of New South Wales, and they write back and say, yes, we have 2 DeQuincy letters. Why, is that of interest? Yes, it is of interest. Send me those scans now. And then they pop the scans in the mail, and the archivist is usually delighted that somebody wants something out of their collection, which I do. So it's grown. I have found DeQuincy letters in the UK and the UK's archives that hold more letters than they thought they did. The reason I keep going to these archives is because I show up and I say, I understand you've got 16 DeQuincy letters. And they say, yes, we do. And they bring out the letters. And then I say, there's not a chance you've got like something else, is there? And the archivist says, oh, well, I can take a look, maybe. Right? And then they come back and they go, we've got these 4 letters. Would that be of interest? In other words, you're trusting the online catalog to be accurate. And I make all kinds of mistakes. And sometimes the people using the online catalog, they make mistakes. It's much, much better to be sat there in the room and saying, is there anything else? Could you look? And one of the places that I keep finding them is tipped into books. They bring out books that were, that someone's got some connection to DeQuincy, and you open up the book and there's a DeQuincy letter tipped into the front of the book. That's a letter. That counts. In several instances, this is because a letter has turned up tipped into a book, as in this example, as in this 4 December 1857 letter from DeQuincy to his publisher, James Hogg. I just called up that book and I opened the book, and there's a DeQuincy letter that someone has tipped in. I have found other DeQuincy letters in published volumes by autograph and manuscript collectors in old auction house catalogs, in booksellers' inventories, on eBay, on Rare Book Hub, and on the Antiquarian Book Exchange. There are 5 letters for sale this evening on Antiquarian Book Exchange, Abe, that if I was a wealthy man, that is to say, not an academic, I would buy. But one of them is 5,300 quid. Well, I'm not buying that. It's interesting. It's a very interesting, but I'm not buying it. And the cheapest one is 1,200 pounds. So that's quite a lot. It's about 80 words, this letter, and it's 1,200 quid. So that's, not something I'm likely to acquire. So that's fine, but it's sat there. And so I can go visit the bookseller, and the bookseller's got scans of it, but booksellers are very reluctant to let me come in and just sort of transcribe it. They think that it's going to devalue the letter. Now, I think it's going to increase the value of the letter because it will tell them, it will make clear how important this letter is. But they don't see it like that, and they own it. So I have to look at the scan on the internet. Most surprisingly, after writing hundreds and hundreds of emails to libraries and archives all around the world, so 18 months ago, I decided I had to write roughly 900 archives around the world and just say, hi, I'm editing the letters to DeQuincy. Do you have any DeQuincy letters? And 95, so I think I probably wrote about 900 emails. You go on the website, you check the online catalog, they don't have anything. You type in DeQuincy spelled properly, and then there's kind of 3 common misspellings of DeQuincy. You do all that. If you can't find anything, then you write the archive and you say, have you got any uncollected material? And 96% of them or 97% write back and say, no. Why would we have any material by Thomas DeQuincy? And you say, I just thought it was off chance. Thank you very much. But 3% write back and they say, yes, we have Case Western Reserve Library or University in Cleveland, Ohio, has 3 DeQuincy letters. And when I'm sitting there writing Case Western Reserve Library, I'm thinking, are you wasting your life, Robert? Like, should you be writing Case Western Reserve? What's that got to do with anything? And then they write back and say, why, yes, Howard Garber, one of our alum who collected 2,000 autographs and manuscripts, donated his collection to us in 1996, and it contains 2 DeQuincy letters. Right. Well, that's why I did it. So 97% no, that's not a great average, but when you probably picked up 40 letters or 45 letters via this method. So that was very exhausting and exciting. The libraries that I didn't expect to have DeQuincy letters include the State Library of New South Wales, 2 DeQuincy letters, the University of British Columbia Special Collections, 1 DeQuincy letter, Case Western Reserve, the Watt Library in Greenock, outside of Glasgow, and several others. A DeQuincy letter even turned up in the archive of the Maine Historical Society. Now, when I got the letter back from the Maine Historical Society saying, oh, yes, we have a DeQuincy letter, my heart, I have to say, stopped, because I thought, well, if the Maine Historical Archive has a DeQuincy letter, which archive in the world do I not need to write anybody anywhere at any time? And you get a little crazy, right? You walk into a museum and you think, are there DeQuincy letters here? Is there a DeQuincy letter in the basement here? You start to lose it a little. Anyway, the Maine Historical Archive has one DeQuincy letter. And I wrote to the woman who was absolutely delighted that somebody knew that they, had asked the question. And I said, you got to tell me how you've got it. And she said, someone who moved to the state of Maine bought a DeQuincy letter at auction in 1951 in Edinburgh. And he collected all sorts of other things. And when he died, his archive came to us and we cataloged it. And that's how we have a DeQuincy letter. And I thought, so it's got nothing to do with what DeQuincy was connected with. It's got to do with who bought DeQuincy in the years after his death, which means you've got to write everywhere. So I've talked to all sorts of different people who are editing letters of different figures. Percy Shelley's letters are coming out. William Godwin's letters are coming out. Wilkie Collins's letters are coming out. Robert Southey's letters are coming out. Robert Burns's letters are coming out. And when I say to these people, this is what I've done, they sort of blanch. And they say, how long did that take? And I said, a long time. It took a long time, a lot of 10-hour days in a row. And they say, I think I have to do that. And I say, you do. You do. Because there's 7 Percy Shelley letters out there, man. And you got to find them. And so, so the guy who's working on Wilkie Collins said, I think I'm going to hire a research assistant. And I said, that's a good idea. But it also helps when you do it yourself and you can be very, very sure. Anyway, I'll stop talking about that. I'm still waiting to hear back from about 50 archives. If the Maine Historical Society has a DeQuincy letter, which archive in the world or on Jupiter might not have a DeQuincy letter? In many of these cases, the archive, as I said, seems to hold the DeQuincy letter, not because DeQuincy had any connection to the area, but because some local collector left it to the archive as part of a larger donation. So this is one of 5 letters in the Pennsylvania Historical Society. And the guy said, well, I can send you because it's not online. And then he goes to the card catalog. And some of you who are as old as me or around that will remember the card catalog. And you look at the card catalog and he hauls out 5 DeQuincy letters. And I said to him, can you please take a picture of the card catalog? I remember the card catalog when I began my undergraduate career, etc. So he sent me this, which is a November 29th, 1821 letter from DeQuincy to his landlord, an autographed letter signed. So I got 5 letters from the Pennsylvania Historical Society. They're typically in card catalogs that have not yet been put online. I have to add that there are 2 DeQuincy letters in the Bath Record Office. And I walked in and went, is there any chance? And the wonderful guy there went away and he said, we have 2 DeQuincy letters. And I thought they were going to be DeQuincy letters from Bath, but they weren't DeQuincy letters from Bath. He wrote them in London in the 1820s, but the Bath Record Office had 2 DeQuincy letters. So I sat, where am I? Well, you know where the Bath Record Office is, right? And just across from the Abbey. And I went in and did the 2 letters. It's absolutely fabulous. Not finding DeQuincy letters, however, or not gaining access to them is much more problematic. 2 private collectors who are also professors of British Romanticism have very generously said that I can transcribe the DeQuincy letters in their collection and I can include them in the forthcoming edition. They have the same job as I do. They're quite sympathetic, very sympathetic, and they've said, that's absolutely fine, Rob. You can come sleep on my couch and transcribe my DeQuincy letters. And I said, that's great. A 3rd private collector who I have been shunned by private collectors. They do not answer my email. But who was not a professor of British Romanticism, but a lovely, lovely guy, contacted me in January of this year and said, hi, Professor Morrison, I have a DeQuincy letter. Would you like to see it? And I said, yes, I would. And he sent me a scan of it. And then I met him at the National Archives a couple of weeks ago. And now most of my day is spent corresponding with him about Wilkie Collins and Thomas DeQuincy. And he just said, I'll let you see the letter, which is right there. He has one letter. With a series of other private collectors, however, I have had far less luck. And when I say I have had far less luck, what I mean is absolutely no luck at all. That is to say, I write and they don't respond, which is absolutely fine. It's their letter, they own it. But boy, I'd be happy if they'd write me back with a scan. But that's not happened. So it is frustrating to watch a DeQuincy letter come onto the market, be purchased by a private collector, and then probably disappear from view. Though with just enough tantalizing information on the online auction house description to keep me awake 2 to 3 times each evening. So the primary example, as you can see in this, in the right-hand side at the bottom, number 1, Tate Correspondence, a collection of 37 unpublished DeQuincy letters to William Tate, his publisher, February 20th, 1838 to August 15th, 1846, now in the possession of M. Ronald Brunkenfeld, President Street, Brooklyn, New York. And Dr. Brunkenfeld died in 1999. What happened to his letters? So I have tried, I don't want to say how many hours of my professorship I have exhausted trying to find out where those 30, it's not 2 letters, it's not 5 letters, it's not even 15 letters, it's 37 letters. And I really don't want, because you know what day they'll all be discovered? The day after Oxford says, here's your edition. Oh, and Brunkenfeld's letters have been found. That's what I'm trying to avoid. So how do I find letters? He taught at Columbia. I contacted Columbia University and I said, please, you must have these letters. And the guy wrote back, no, we don't have those letters. Are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. We didn't get his letters. They got other things, but they didn't get his letters. So one of my jobs when I return to Canada, to North America, is to see if I can find those letters. But you know, I don't want to like bug anybody, and the family owns them or whatever it is, but I would sure like to get to see those letters, please. So I have found the following advice very helpful. You are producing a collected edition of DeQuincy's letters, but you are not producing a complete edition of DeQuincy's letters. If I thought I was producing a complete edition of DeQuincy's letters, I think I'd be mad by now, because how am I gonna get them if they're in private hands? So what is a letter? Let me turn to that topic. DeQuincy published several essays in the form of letters, most famously a 5-part essay called Letters to a Young Man Whose Education Has Been Neglected, which appeared in the same magazine as he published Confessions of an English Opium-Eater in 2 years later, London Magazine in 1823. And these are letters that are very consciously written as magazine articles. They're not private letters. They are using the letter form and the intimacy it creates, or the informality it creates, to produce a magazine article. Loads and loads and loads of people did this. So they're not going in the edition. I think that's a letter, that's a different thing. DeQuincy also published his first 2 Blackwoods Magazine essays on murder, considered as one of the fine arts in the form of letters. So his second paper on murder, considered as one of the fine arts, this is a page from Blackwoods Magazine, begins, Dr. North, you are a liberal man, and DeQuincy uses the fiction of a letter to discuss the aesthetics of violence. And I would say, I cannot stop myself from saying, led directly to people like Edgar Allan Poe and the rise of crime and detective fiction. Foucault makes this point in Discipline and Punish. So this I found in the National Library of South Africa. Do you have any DeQuincy manuscripts? And South Africa wrote back and said, yes, we do. This is a fragment. It's not a letter. It's a single sheet business document that a man named Len Dillon donated to the National Library of South Africa in 1892. The fragment reveals that on 12 August 1802, the 16-year-old DeQuincy signed over his property in the library to Mr. J. Lees. Now, if you're me, you say, I've been studying DeQuincy for 40 years. What library? What shares in what library is DeQuincy got? According to the online catalog in the National Library of South Africa, the manuscript concerns DeQuincy shares in the Manchester Subscription Library. That's news to me. I didn't know DeQuincy had shares in that. So you can see, I signed over my property in the library to Mr. Lees, witness my hand on this day, the 12th of August, 1802, Thomas DeQuincy. I'm just going to interrupt myself for a second to say, DeQuincy was born Thomas Quincey. And the is a fiction. that he inserted. And he inserted it here in Bath because his mother wanted to make their climb up the social hierarchies easier, and she thought Quincey sounded a bit trade, and DeQuincy was more aristocratic. And so she put the DeQuincy in. And then Hannah Moore, who is a name that many of you will know, said, you can't do that. That's very, very worldly. So Mrs. DeQuincy became Mrs. Quincey. And one Saturday morning, John Strachan and Carol found Mrs. Quincey's grave in the Abbey, Bath Abbey churchyard. And then John and I went one morning. John arrived in front of my house with spades and clippers, and we drove up the hill and we went to the grave. And I already asked the Bath Abbey people, can I move past the, all the weeds and bracken and stuff on the grave? And they said, yes. And so we did. So John and I stood there and we pulled up all things, and underneath all the weeds and the bramble and all the rest of it, it was a beautifully preserved stone, and it said Elizabeth Quincey, and it gave her death date, January 8th, 1846. And then Jane Quincey, death date, 2nd of May, 1871, I think. And it's beautifully, it's preserved. That's absolutely wonderful. And it's not Mrs. Elizabeth DeQuincy, it's Elizabeth Quincey. So DeQuincy liked very much, well, A, to annoy his mother, and B, to feel like a bit of an outsider, or like very much like an outsider. So when you're writing, like, for example, a biography of him, all his family is called Quincey, and he's DeQuincy, and that's engraved on his mother's headstone. So in a famous passage in Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, DeQuincy describes preparing to bolt from Manchester Grammar School on a cloudless July morning in 1802, roughly 1 month before he signed the business document. And this is a highly romanticized moment in Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, and a moment that DeQuincy refers to on a number of other occasions. But as is so often the case, DeQuincy's many published accounts of his own life create a different impression than the one that unfolds in his private letters, or indeed in the business and legal documents that reveal various aspects of his life and career. So DeQuincy sort of bolts from school and then charges off to North Wales to sort of find himself. And the thought that he sat down and signed a business document, turning over his shares in the property of the Manchester Subscription Library, doesn't really fit that narrative. And that's what I found with the letters over and over and over again. What DeQuincy tells us, like all of us, right? There's a public side and there's a private side. The letters are more apt to release the private side, and it tells a pretty different story than the public published side. This is a note that appears on the flyleaf of Eleanor Louisa Montague's The Landgrave, which is a play in 5 acts that she based on DeQuincy's Gothic romance Cloisterham, which he published in 1832. From Miss Montague, the authoress, to myself, DeQuincy writes, you can see, I to Florence DeQuincy, his middle daughter, this day, Friday, June 2nd, 1843. Now, what do I do with that? Is that a letter? That's an inscription. I'm not sure it's a letter. Does this kind of record or reminder or inscription belong in an edition of the letters of Thomas DeQuincy? Certainly, it seems to me it overlaps with a letter in intriguing ways, and not in this, and in this instance, not least because it is to Florence DeQuincy, this day, Friday, June 2nd, 1843. DeQuincy wrote several letters to the editor. Now, do those go in the edition? If it's a letter to the editor, this is a letter to the editor of the London Magazine. Now, we don't have the manuscript. We don't have DeQuincy's hand writing that. Now, that always makes me queasy. Did they make that? Did we know that? Is that what DeQuincy said? We've not got a manuscript, but DeQuincy didn't write a letter to the magazine the next month or complain. There's no record of DeQuincy complaining or denying it. So does that go in? He wrote several letters to the Westmoreland Gazette. He wrote to the London Magazine, and it's something he did across his career. Now, letters to the editor seem to me to be much closer to belonging in an edition of his letters. Further, DeQuincy wrote letters that he seems to intended for publication, but that got denied, that he didn't publish. And the most famous of these is his letter to William Tate, concerning the poetry of Wordsworth, which DeQuincy dates the 16th of May, 1838. And he writes to Tate, my dear sir, 5 years ago, it may be, since accidents of literary speculation first introduced me to your acquaintance. Now, Tate doesn't publish the essay, but doesn't publish the letter. The essay, I'm not sure, but it's in the form of a letter. DeQuincy clearly intended it to be published, but does that go in? It was clearly intended for Tate's magazine, but it got rejected. So I don't know what to do with that. I'm putting it off. DeQuincy's third son, Francis John DeQuincy, received his medical degree from the University of Edinburgh and wrote his thesis on the religious objections to the use of chloroform in obstetric medicine. At the end of his 65-page manuscript, Francis appends the following note. Soon after the discovery of chloroform, I wrote to my father upon the subject of religious objections and received, and in reply, received from him the following letter. And that letter is at the end of Francis's medical thesis. And you can see this is Francis DeQuincy's hand transcribing a letter that he got from his dad. So it's December 1847, and it's his father writing, "My dear Francis," to his son, "say this fact to the papa." So does that go in? We don't have DeQuincy's version of that he sent to Francis, but that's what Francis said his dad said. So again, there's that sort of queasiness. Well, if I haven't got it in DeQuincy's hand, does that go in? And then you think, well, it's his son. It sounds like but we don't have it in DeQuincy's hand. So I think that goes in. There's got to be a big head note with a flashing neon light, right? Which says, this is not in DeQuincy's hand. This is not in DeQuincy's hand. However, it's probably by DeQuincy. Okay, let me turn to the penultimate section, reading a DeQuincy letter. This is something that I was very worried about when I started. What if I just can't read his hand? Like, what if I just can't read it? There are some people whose hands, don't give themselves up very easily. And when DeQuincy is strung out on opium and haggard and tired and writing on tiny sheets of paper and starts abbreviating things, Cal and I have sat there and gone, well, I don't know. That says something about Wordsworth, but I don't know what it is. And then, we come back the next day and go, well, maybe that's a but. It's a long, painful process. We usually get there, but so this is a letter that is cross-written. Anybody who's worked with 19th century letters knows about cross-writing. The letter writer, Austin does this all the time. It saves money. Go across this way, right? And when you finish covering the letter this way, you turn it and you go across, you cross-write it. Because if you don't cross-write it, you don't get to say all you want to say, or you got to pay more money. And we don't want that. So they didn't. So this is DeQuincy cross-writing. Now, that's in the Jurwood Center in Grasmere. We did quite well with this, because if you put a sheet of paper underneath underneath the line and sort of try not to see the text going like this, you can actually make reasonable progress. This was a little uglier. This was a lot uglier. Yeah, they're just trying to cram as much information as possible. And you think, oh, I'm really glad they got to, but bloody hell, it's a bad day when you turn it over and go, oh, that's the next letter? Okay, maybe we need a cup of tea. In fact, maybe we should just go to the pub and come back tomorrow when we attempt to do that. So there's a DeQuincy letter. Reading a DeQuincy letter is quite a challenge. If you're doing an edition of Austen's novels, you don't go, I hope the text is okay. It's printed. It's printed. It changes everything. It changes everything. So this is again in the Jurwood Center. You can see there's a little piece of paper there that's been ripped out. It's been caught by the wax of the letter. And it fits, we think, in the hole on the other side. Now, how it got with the wax on the back of it to the other side, I'm not quite sure. And of course, you can't see what's underneath it. You can't just pull it off and go, what did he bloody? You gotta put, piece of paper over my text. I can't read. So that happens. I mean, it's unusual, but the wax does cause problems. It obliterates text and things get stuck to it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is from the Manchester Central Library. And the catalogue said at the top, it read what this says: DeQuincy, curious fragment refers to a case of children in Oud carried off and brutalized by wolves. And we looked at that and went, curious fragment about children brutalized by wolves. Well, and then we said, well, we should call up everything. We better call it up. And we called it up, and there it is. It's a curious fragment that is a letter about children brutalized and carried off by wolves. So DeQuincy's read this book, and there's this anecdote in it, and he thinks he can turn it into an article. That's what the letter is about. But there's a DeQuincy letter at the bottom. So if you see curious fragment and go, oh, that's just a curious fragment, you're going to, so that does the same thing to you that Maine Historical Archive does, which is it makes you think, if there's anything in here that's got anything to do with Thomas Quincey, I want to see it, because a curious fragment that is a letter is information that might have appeared in the card on the online catalog. So you quickly realize you can't trust anybody and you got to look everything yourself. But that's okay. You probably knew that going in. It's just that stuff like that underscores it. So this is my great triumph in the pursuit of DeQuincy letters. This is a letter that Carol and I own. Carol came to know of the ownership after we owned it. But I was going through eBay. I used to go through eBay every Monday morning, like 5 in the morning. I'd look at eBay, you know, eBay Canada, eBay America, eBay UK. And I looked one morning at eBay Europe. And there was a letter by Thomas Quincey for 110 quid in Italy. And I got out my Visa card and bought it. Because I thought, well, if I burn the 110 quid, but if I don't burn the 110 quid, I'm going to get a DeQuincy letter. And 2 weeks later, through the door came this letter, which is unquestionably a DeQuincy letter. And so for 110 quid, I became the proud owner of DeQuincy letter. And in the edition, it's going to say, you know, Morrisonian collection or something, which sounds very grand. It's just this one sheet of paper. But anyway, that's what's going to happen. So this letter, which is tiny, 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 I have lunch every Sunday with my friend John, and I took him the letter and he opened it up. He couldn't believe it. It's just this tiny little sheet of paper, which I would bring tonight, but of course I can't. It's like, you know, behind bars and in a glass case. So the reason I bring it is because at the top, or the reason I talk about it, at the top, you can see it says Thomas DeQuincy to Sir W. Scott. Now, DeQuincy and Scott are in Edinburgh at the same time, and their politics are both well to the right, and sometimes well to the right. And so I have a very dear bookseller friend in Edinburgh, and he told me a long time ago, what you want is a bookseller who has made a mistake in the listing. That is to say, that might indicate that he or she doesn't know what they've got. This letter cannot be to Walter Scott because it's 1839 and Scott died in 1832. So if you're looking to buy, you think, maybe he doesn't realize that letter's worth 10 times that amount. And so the inscription isn't in DeQuincy's hand, but that's what it said. Then you come down and it says, Thursday night, December 12th, 1839, my dear sir. You can see the stain on the left-hand side of the top. If you are very imaginative, you can turn that into opium and think, oh, DeQuincy went to get a drink of opium, slopped it on the letter, and that's what that stain is. I think it's probably more likely to be tea, but it could be opium. You come down, my dear sir. I think it's probably to a man named John Wilson, whose statue is on Princess Street in Edinburgh and who was really the intellectual engine of Blackwood's magazine, and a very close friend of DeQuincy. But they must have been, if it is, they must have been having an argument, because DeQuincy would normally say, my dear Wilson. And this is my dear sir, which is a very formal way of addressing. So maybe it isn't Wilson. And if it isn't Wilson, I don't know who it is. But he begins, my dear sir, could you furnish me with a little money this evening? Which is the way many DeQuincy letters begin. I'm broke, send money, at last gasp, TDQ. So the letter is very short, and you can see at the bottom, yours ever most truly. That says yours ever most truly in DeQuincy's strung out hand. And then his signature has been cut off because lots of people collected autographs in DeQuincy's age, and his sister or his daughter friend would cut off and send it to, you know, Maggie in London or in Connecticut or something like that. And then you would, you know, the dream would be that you'd find the signature which goes with that letter. So on the verso, we have this, Sir W. Scott. No, it's not. It is not to Scott. And there's no, I mean, DeQuincy didn't know Scott. We have no indication that he knew Scott. And there's no way he said, my dear sir, could you lend me a little money tonight? That's really beyond the realm of conceivable. But below that line, you can see someone else in another hand. So you get this sense of, it's like a palimpsest, right? There's these layers of people who have written, you see all these different hands, including DeQuincy's. Below the line, someone's written the more likely possibility, which is Wilson. But I don't know who, I don't know who it's to, but it's not to Scott. Well, it can't be to Scott in 1839. And I think it's more likely to be to Wilson when they're having an argument, because DeQuincy keeps asking his close friend for money, which generates arguments. So there is the letter, and that proved a real challenge to decipher, because there's one word in it that is exercise, but DeQuincy spells it with a Y. And we were in the National Library of Scotland, and Carol came across another letter where DeQuincy spells exercise with a Y. And that was a very exciting moment, because then we knew that it was a day's exercise. Okay, so let me turn to the final section, the letters of Thomas Quincy, DeQuincy in the literature of addiction. Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and DeQuincy launched in the early 19th century the highly seductive myth that anyone could become a poet if he or she swallowed enough drugs. So this, there's various ways of making this point, but Will Self, in a book called Junk Mail, which is a collection of essays, and one of the essays is called The Naked Tea, Will Self reports a conversation with Phil Robson, a doctor at an Oxfordshire unit for alcohol and drug dependency. Everyone wants to believe that they can write Kubla Khan when they're on drugs, Robson tells Self, even when they're gouching out on a sofa with a burning fag in their lap. Now, of course, as many of you know, Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan, he says, under the inspiration of opium, wrote it in 1797, didn't publish it till 1816 with Byron's help. And 5 years later, DeQuincy published Confessions of an English Opium-Eater. And these two texts are generally seen as creating this myth. Now, the person who indicts this myth most severely is a man named Theodore Dalrymple in a book from 2006 called Romancing Opiates. And Dalrymple begins his third chapter as follows. In modern society, the main cause of drug addiction, and I always have to back up, because not one of the causes or the main cause. So sometimes people say, well, literature, you know, poetry doesn't make anything happen. That's what Auden says. Poetry doesn't make anything happen, right? But according to Dalrymple, not that it's a good thing. It's not a good thing. It's a bad thing. But poetry, I believe, does make things happen. And sometimes those things aren't very good. And sometimes those things are joyous. And sometimes they're a mixture of those two things. But I believe poetry does. I believe with Percy Shelley that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. In modern society, the main cause of drug addiction is a literary tradition of romantic claptrap, started by Coleridge and DeQuincy and continued without serious interruption ever since. So Kubla Khan, Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, and then Edgar Allan Poe and Wilkie Collins, Robert Louis Stevenson, and blah, 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 up until, you know, through Burroughs and so on. DeQuincy, in his published writings, takes a variety of approaches to opium. This is DeQuincy. His daughter is going to India and is going to marry a military man, and this is DeQuincy. And he has 3 daughters. This is DeQuincy with his youngest daughter, Emily, who's standing, and his eldest daughter, Margaret, and that's Margaret's baby, Eva. And that's the portrait that they gave to Florence, who's the middle daughter, before she set off for India, which is why she's not in it, which seems a bit curious to me. I think she would want to be in it, but that's what they gave her as a going away present. So in DeQuincy's published works, opium is a source of euphoria. And this is one of the famous moments of Confessions when DeQuincy says, I had a toothache. It's not that I was looking for pleasure. That's not what happened. I had a terrible, terrible toothache, he claims. And he suffers for 3 weeks with his toothache, right? Part of this has got to be apocryphal, but that's what he claims. And finally, someone says, well, you know, if you're in that much pain, you should take some opium. And DeQuincy in Confession says, opium? What's opium? I've never heard of opium. Okay, I'll go try it. He goes back to his lodgings and and in retrospect, he writes, I took it. And in an hour, oh heavens, what a revulsion, what an upheaving from its lowest depths of the inner spirit, what an apocalypse of the world within me. That my pains had vanished was now a trifle in my eyes. This negative effect was swallowed up in the immensity of those positive effects which had opened before me, in the abyss of divine enjoyment thus suddenly revealed. Here was a panacea. Here was the secret of happiness. It's also, once DeQuincy becomes what we would call addicted. They didn't call it addicted in DeQuincy's age. Addiction as a sort of a pharmacological medical concept didn't come into being until the early 20th century. So DeQuincy didn't have an opium addiction. He had an opium habit. He had a bad habit with all the moral weight and censoriousness that involves. And it wasn't a case of, well, you should see a counselor and go into rehab. It was a case of, you're a degenerate who cannot stop this habit. We now have a more, I think, a compassionate understanding of addiction, but the blight of opiates, which is what opium obviously is, continues. DeQuincy said it gave him powerful nightmares, and he describes these nightmares, and lots of people read these nightmares of horror and went, that sounds pretty cool. In other words, DeQuincy says even the nightmares didn't pass the boundary of pleasure. People went, oh, it's going to make me dream vividly, maybe I'll take it, which they did. Not Carlyle, but many others did. So this is DeQuincy's Gothic nightmare, one of the most famous. And in this nightmare, Quincy says, I was stared at. You just watch the role of the prose. The prose is extraordinary, I think. I was stared at, hooted at, grinned at, chattered at by monkeys, by parakeets, by cockatoos. I ran into pagodas and was fixed for centuries at the summit or in secret rooms. I was the idol. I was the priest. I was worshipped. I was sacrificed. I fled from the wrath of Brahma through all the forests of Asia. Vishnu hated me. Shiva laid wait for me. I came suddenly upon the Isis and Osiris. I had done a deed, they said, which the ibis and the crocodile trembled at. Now, the impact of that for many, many people was, you know what? This is in the pains of opium section. A lot of people read that and went, you know what? I think I might try that. That sounds pretty exciting. And lots of people did. Somerset Maugham, a century later, took opium and said, I just sat back and waited for DeQuincy's, Gothic nightmares. In other words, people become addicted to DeQuincy's version of it rather than the pharmacological. So the woman I know, a woman in my university at home in Ontario, who has studied heroin for 30 years, said, a lot of what DeQuincy says in Confessions, especially about constipation, is incredibly up-to-date and modern. But she said there's little or no pharmacological evidence that it gives you nightmares. That might be a DeQuincian invention, or he was a vivid dreamer beforehand. So it might have just been a continuation of what was already there. For DeQuincy, opium also on occasion is a source of humor. This is one of my favorite quotations of DeQuincy. Since leaving off opium, he remarked after 35 years of addiction, I take a great deal too much of it for my health. So the paradox of opium as poison and as cure is writ large. And DeQuincy, in a sort of jovial mood, can make fun of it. In the revised version of Confessions, where opium appears as a kind of salvation, DeQuincy publishes Confessions in 1821. 35 years go by, and he writes a revised version in 1856. And in the revised version, we might expect him to say, as he does in the letters, it's dragged me through absolute hell. But DeQuincy wants to establish himself as a kind of Victorian man of letters. And so he says, actually, on balance, it's been a blessing. Right? That really gets Dalrymple going. In the revised version of Confessions, published just 3 years before his death, DeQuincy dies when he's 74 years old. So this is 1856. DeQuincy dies 8 December 1859. DeQuincy describes opium as a blessing. It provides relief from tedium vitae. So it provides relief from the tediousness of life. Right? You want to jazz up your life, you give it a little sparkle, take some laudanum. It supports preternatural calls for exertion. So DeQuincy says, I'll get that article done, I'll get that article done, I'll get that article done. 16 hours to the deadline, he hasn't written anything, swallows some laudanum, believes it gives him the energy to get it done. So it's been a blessing because it's enabled him to earn money. It has astonishing powers over the shadowy world of dreams. Not according to my friend Sella in Kingston, Ontario, who says, I've been studying it for 30 years. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's ever talked about that. And beyond all other known agents, it is the mightiest for its command, or for the extent of its command over pain. That's why opiates are still used today, because nothing brings down pain like an opiate. And so people use them. In his letters, however, DeQuincy tells a far grittier, sadder, unnerving narrative of drug use and abuse. There is no bliss in his letters about opium. There is no humor. There is no sublimity. There is no redemption. It is a much, much grimmer tale. Opium has imprisoned DeQuincy in the letters, the DeQuincy of the letters, in what he calls the unimaginable hell of addiction. So published version, it's a blessing. Letters reveal the unimaginable hell of addiction. So let me close by giving you an example of one of the most haunting DeQuincy letters, haunting for me. The worst letters are when his kids are hungry, when he's trying to write and his kids are hungry. And you know that he's spent considerable sums on brandy and considerable sums on the drug. And his daughter Emily is hungry, and he is enduring privation because he's wanting them to eat before he does, and the stress of it is just terrible. He's an addict, and it causes the problems that we're familiar with. So DeQuincy is writing to Wilson, to his friend Wilson, and he says, I endure the extremity of personal privations, some of which it would be humiliating to describe. I think that's often DeQuincy's polite way of talking about constipation. Opiates cause fierce constipation. And the woman I speak to at home in Canada, where fentanyl and opiates are the terrible thing that they are everywhere, when I talk to her about it, she says sometimes the pain of constipation is what gets people off heroin, because the pain is just so ferocious. And when DeQuincy talks about humiliating to describe, I think that's what he's gesturing toward. But by way of illustration, I may mention that having in a moment of pinching difficulty for my children, DeQuincy's wife dies August 8th, 1837, and this is 1840, so he's been raising 8 children by himself for 3 years. That having in a moment of pinching difficulty for my children, about 10 months since, pawned every article of dress which would produce a shilling. I have since that time had no stockings, no shoes, no neck handkerchief, coat, waistcoat, or hat. He's in Edinburgh in the winter. And for those of you who've been in Edinburgh in the winter, you'd want a pair of socks. I can promise you that. I have sate constantly barefoot, and being constitutionally, or from the use of opium, unusually sensible of cold, I should really have been unable to sit up and write, but for a counterpane which I wrap around my shoulders. Such hardships I could support with some cheerfulness, were they of any use. Now, I published a biography of DeQuincy in 2009, and this is the cover of the British paperback. And one of the things that started to emerge when I had lunch with my friend John on Sunday, I read the first couple letters and I went, oh, you know, when I talk about that in my biography, I have to revise that in the light of the letter that I've just read or just found more often. And then I found more letters and I went, uh-oh, that whole front section there needs to be a little bit polished up, because now I know that he was in London, and before I didn't know. So, you know, the prose gets a little spongy instead of nice and hard, because I didn't know. Now I do know. And so over the course of 4 years, not only has the edition perhaps grown by a volume, but there's this sort of, should I revise the biography in the light of all the information I'm getting from the letters? And my friend John says, yes, you should. If you don't do it, someone else is going to do it. You're going to work and do it and publish it. And someone's going to go, oh, you know, the world needs, now that Morrison's done all that work, well, we need a new edition of a biography of Thomas Quincey. So then should I do that? I don't know if I should do that. I'm old. I'm tired. you know, should I do that? And then I think, oh, bloody hell, you've got to do it. And then I think, no, you don't. You've already done it. So you could, there's a little insight into in my tortured psyche. Okay, so I'm going to finish this letter. Such hardships I could support with some cheerfulness worthy of any use to others. But the painful result from the whole is that after paying little to any creditor but one, as regards that one, I am £100 worse than when I began. This is terrific. It is my hope that when my edition of DeQuincy's letters is finished, it will serve, among other things, it'll illuminate travel in Victorian Britain. It will illuminate DeQuincy's friendships. It will illuminate the world of the periodical press. It will illuminate his personal relationships, the careers of his children, and so on. But for me, one of the very most important things that I think it will do is serve as a counterweight to the mythologizing and the romanticizing of opiates that DeQuincy undertakes in his published work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And we have an opportunity to ask him some questions. So get prepared and I'll get the mic.
Right. Oh, you're going to hand the mic to them.
I will.
Right.
So that the people online will be able to hear your question, and then we'll go to online to see if they had it.
Right.
Now, Ian promised me there'd be loads of good questions, so.
Dad usually asks a pretty good question.
I know, but Jude is first. Here we go.
All right.
I don't know if this is a good question. His daughters, his three daughters.
Yes.
Is there any correspondence from them or to them that you've encountered?
Yes. They're fascinating. They're fascinating, especially the middle daughter, Florence. Just after I finished the biography, I finished it on March 12, 2009. And I mailed it off to the publisher in London. And I felt this, you know, I got to the end of it, you know, he died and I was at the end. And then I opened this big stack of mail that had, you know, been coming in like 6 weeks or 2 months. And I thought, I can't look at that. I got to get this book done. So I opened it. And one of them was from a man named Jeff Cowton, who's the curator at the Wordsworth Museum in Grasmere and a very dear friend. And Jeff said, Rob, have you seen this? And it was a bookseller catalog, Michael Silverman. And Michael Silverman had 128 letters by DeQuincy's daughters that he had sold to the British Library. And I went, oh, you've got to be kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. So I phoned the publisher and I said, hi, Alan, it's Rob. You know that book I sent you? Stop everything. I can't, you can't. And Carol said, you got to fly to London. Right. And so I flew to London and I sat in the British Library and I changed the biography in 21 spots. And there was one moment when his daughter said, oh, Daddy's in the corner reading Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Right. I don't know DeQuincy's reading Elizabeth Barrett Browning. DeQuincy's reading Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So, you know, so I'd run back to the hotel at lunch, crack open a paragraph and stick in. And then DeQuincy turned and read Elizabeth Barrett Browning. His daughters, Margaret, his eldest daughter, moves to Ireland, marries a man named Robert Craig and moves to Ireland. Florence marries a man named Richard Baird Smith in Calcutta in 1856. He died. He plays a leading role in the Indian Mutiny, dies in 1861 on the way back to England. And then she is courted by a man named Edward Law Lushington, who married Tennyson's sister Celia. So there's a connection to Tennyson. And then Emily never marries, dies in 1917. And DeQuincy writes many letters to them. I can't find a letter to his son other than the one that's in Francis's thesis, but he's very, very fond of his daughters. And Carol, when we were in the National Library of Scotland, the National Library of Scotland has a whole, how long was that? Like 200 pages or something. It was a lot of letters from Florence. And Carol opened it and she was writing to her future husband. And she said, I just got a letter from Papa. Here is what he said, : And then she wrote, and I went, that's a DeQuincy letter. So we got 2 DeQuincy letters that are part of Florence's text. It's very hard not to think of the Brontes when you see these 3 bright, articulate women sitting, reading contemporary literature and commenting on it. And DeQuincy writes them often, and they write to him often. And they speak of him with enormous fondness. Carol and I were both really struck. You know, Emily is hungry, and yet when in the 1850s, when everything calms down, they're very, very fond of him. Remarkable. At least in their letters, they say they are. It's remarkable. I've just blathered. Does that answer it? Okay, yeah. The letters in the British Library are really interesting. Really, really interesting.
It occurs to me from what you're saying that maybe if you were giving advice, you'd say, do the letters first and then write the book.
Yeah, that might have been an idea. Well,
I know it's too late
Yeah,
now.
it is. Like so many things in my life. That would have been a very good idea. That's not what I did. I thought we knew most of them, but we didn't.
Right.
Thank you, British Academy. Thank you, Bass Bob.
Right. Here's a question.
I assume that the letters, or most of them, were private letters and weren't letters that were written, as some authors did, thinking these will be published after my death. So did you feel any sense of intrusion reading the letters which were not addressed to you?
That's a very good question. A lot of the letters concern business. They concern an article that he wants to revise. They concern how much he's going to be paid. They concern, if I write you 6 paragraphs, will you send me a shilling so my children can eat tonight? That sort of thing. It is a very, very different thing. I don't think I felt guilty reading them. Maybe that's a flaw. But I spent a lot of time wanting to know about this guy, and this is like all this access. But I also think that DeQuincy has been misunderstood, and I also think that DeQuincy had a very large ego. And I think he would be very pleased that people were paying attention to him, because I think he felt very often like he had something to say that was important. But there is definitely a sense that this isn't written to me. This is written to somebody else. But that other person kept the letters. They didn't throw it out. They could have done. Think of all the letters that Cassandra Austen threw out. And, you know, Austen's a very interesting case. Letters in general are very, very interesting just as document, because they might have a literary form in the way that Tom suggests and where I began, but they weren't, you know, they were written to communicate information and to communicate sorrow and to communicate. And some of DeQuincy's letters, when he's describing, you know, his humiliation, yeah, it's pretty painful reading. But I also think that he is one of the finest prose writers in the language. And I feel like I'm learning more about how he created that prose and how that prose led to people like Virginia Woolf and the way Virginia Woolf writes a book like To the Lighthouse. And I feel like, on balance, it's a worthwhile endeavor. But it's not like reading a published work at all. And it has sort of involved a kind of recalibration of what the hell it is that I think I'm doing. Do you know, when you write a biography and you think, you don't know that, Robert. That's just what you think. But we've all read biographies where you go, well, the biographer stops and goes, well, I don't really know, so I really shouldn't say. And then you think, bloody hell, if you don't say, then who's gonna say? Go on, have a guess at what you think. There's a very fine biography of Wordsworth where the biographer says, I don't really know if Wordsworth went to France or not, so we just have to leave it a mystery. And my supervisor at Oxford threw down the paper and said, well, if he won't guess, who the hell's going to guess? Right. So there's all kinds of competing emotions, but you're absolutely right to say it's not like picking up a book. It's very, very different. There's only one of that letter. It's very different than writing. And so on balance, I think it's a positive thing for illuminating his life and works. But it's a different experience for sure. And that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Right. So I'll turn to Ian.
So this is a question from Dick. Bateman online.
Okay.
Have any of DeQuincy's letters had content which has really puzzled you?
Oh, yes. Yes, they have. There's a letter where he refers to himself as T. Ellis Manners, which I'm assuming, you know, this whole door yawns open. You go, what is he? So, like, that's a pseudonym. He's T. Ellis Manners. That, you know, I think T-E-L. That's a pseudonym he's used, presumably. He's in Glasgow, and it's a pseudonym he's used, presumably, to avoid debt collectors. But where did he get that? And how many other times did he use that? And how many other times are we looking at something that is DeQuincy under a pseudonym, which of course he used in his published writings, but you know, there's this overlap. And so there's plenty of times when I look at a letter and I go like, this letter that was in, I'll give you another example. This letter that was in private collector's hands, and I went in, there are 2 DeQuincy letters in the National Archives in London, and I went in, transcribed the 2 letters, and I met this man at the archive by arrangement, and he showed me the private letter that he owned. And one of the letters, he said, but DeQuincy gets a coach from London to Manchester. And then when he gets off in Manchester, then he walks across town to get the coach to Glasgow. And I said, what? What do you mean? It comes in the London Manchester coach comes in one spot and he's got to walk 1.5 miles to the other spot to get the northern coach to Glasgow? That can't be. And Paul said, well, you know, and we read the letter and it looks like where DeQuincy came in and where DeQuincy left are 1.5 miles apart. It's like, you know, you come, you know, you land at Gatwick and you fly out of, you know, what is that? What? And so he and I sat there and he said, well, do you not know that? And I said, no, I don't know coach history out of Manchester in the early part of the 19th century. I don't know. But that happens a lot. And then you go, okay, so it's more complicated than I thought. Well, of course it is. Of course it's more complicated. So there are, yeah, every 5 letters you get, oh my God, I've got to annotate these. What am I going to say? So I've got to learn. I've got to find out. Somebody will know. Britain is so wonderful. Somebody will know. Do you know, someone will go, oh, what, coaching history in the early decades of the 19th century in Manchester? I've written 3 books on that. I can tell you exactly where it was. I loved that. I had a manuscript from Harvard that was in Mavor shorthand. This is years ago. Mavor shorthand. I thought, how am I going to get Mavor shorthand? And I tried in Canada, I tried in America, nothing. And I came over here, and the woman at the Institute for Advanced Studies and Humanities at the University of Edinburgh said, oh, we'll find that. And she found somebody, and she mailed it off to 2 different people. And they both wrote back, Mavor shorthand is one of the best known, you know, like, give me a hard one. This is it's simple. Someone will know about the coaching history of Manchester and where the Glasgow coach left from and the London coach arrived. And I'll have to find that person so I can annotate that letter.
Very good. Now, anyone else? Oh, got one here.
I was just curious. You appeared to be a bit skeptical about the idea of toothache
Right.
being a beginner.
Yes.
Having had really bad toothache.
Oh, yes.
I didn't feel so skeptical. I felt sympathetic. And I just wondered why, or if I was right that you were skeptical, and if yes, why?
Toothache is immensely painful, and you would certainly be prescribed laudanum for it. The broader answer is that the 2 most famous opium-eaters at the beginning of the 19th century are Coleridge and DeQuincy. And they get into tussles and arguments all the time, not only about who could drink more, that happens, but they also get into debates about who took it for pain and who took it for pleasure. And Coleridge insists, I never, ever took it for pleasure. It was always to do with pain. And so DeQuincy in Confessions goes, okay, well, I'm not gonna let him get the best of me on that. It's a competition with Coleridge to some extent. And so DeQuincy says, well, I was in pain. I took it because I felt a lot of pain. I'm not disputing how much pain a toothache costs, believe me. I'm disputing DeQuincy's construction of why he began to take opium. Because Coleridge says, I didn't want to take it. I took it. And now we would say, like, if you took opium at the beginning of the 19th century, the doctor would encourage you to do that. You could buy it anywhere. You could buy it from a barber. You could buy it from an apothecary. You could buy it at a rural fair. It was like having aspirin. Right? That's how common it was, completely legal, and it was cheaper than spirits, way cheaper than spirits. So lots of people took it and they felt better. So if you went to the doctor with, a hangnail or a bruise or a tumor or virtually anything, the doctor would say at some point, well, you need some opium. So you go home and you take this opium, cheap, and after a while, you become habituated to it. And then you'd stop because your whatever would be better, or you'd think you should, or whatever it was. And then what we would call withdrawal set in. And you go back to the doctor and you say, oh my God, my joints are aching, and all the symptoms that we now associate with withdrawal. And the doctor would say, you should take some opium. That'll solve the problem. And so it is literally true that millions and millions and millions of people in the 19th century, in this country, in Canada, in North America, in Asia, and all around the world, were what we would now call addicted. And they didn't know they were addicted. And it's a pretty horrifying story because we didn't know what it was. Now we say, oh, it's withdrawal. But DeQuincy doesn't use the term addiction or withdrawal. That's 100 years after he publishes Confessions. So I'm not disputing the agony of the toothache. I'm suggesting that DeQuincy might have constructed some kind of fiction to account for why he did it. In other words, I'm not a pleasure seeker, please. I didn't take it for fun. But then when Confessions gets rolling, it's very clear. I mean, most people would say, including myself, that DeQuincy invented recreational drug taking. That is, before you took opium and it put you to sleep, it was for pain, it was for people. Homer in the Iliad talks about what is probably opium. It's not like DeQuincy invented it, but DeQuincy is the first one to say, I swallowed it, and then I went to the opera, and it seemed a lot better. And then I went for a walk in a crowd, and it was really cool. And then I sat by myself in Liverpool and looked out a window and watched the sun go down and the sun come up. It's fantastic. The recreational use of a substance. DeQuincy's the first one to say, that's what I did. And then I lapsed into what we would call addiction, and then I couldn't get out. Like millions of people then and now went in, couldn't get out. There was a labyrinth in Bath and Sydney Gardens. And when DeQuincy lived here, he played in that labyrinth. And he got lost. He got terrified as a little boy in Bath. He couldn't get out of this labyrinth. And he looks back on it from his adulthood. And he said, that's been my life. I went into this drug. I got caught and I couldn't get out. I went into debt and I got caught and I couldn't get out. And that sense of, he didn't mean to become an addict. He didn't know what addiction was. And then it defines his life. He says, I have spent 50 years revolving around the great sun of opium. That is, I've never been able to break its gravitational pull. Yes. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Robert. Thanks once again. I'm struck by that you responded to the question about, it came up the question of pseudonyms he might have used in particular letters.
Yeah.
So thinking about that the other way around, have you ever come across, I'm interested in any cases or points in which you might have come across letters and you had doubts about the authenticity of something that was signed DeQuincy. Have there been any occasions like that? I mean, I don't know whether there's a great business in DeQuincy forgery out there, but did you have any occasions where that arose, or indeed, how do you establish authenticity? You're referring to cross-referencing spelling across different letters and things.
Right. Well, that's why when I see like the letter in the University of British Columbia, it's in the hand of one of its, I mean, anytime you don't have the original manuscript, you get jumpy because you can't be absolutely sure. Maybe Florence or maybe his son Francis went, well, that's a boring bit. Or, Dad mentioned God, but he could have said more. And maybe Francis is the one that inserts something. So anytime you don't have the manuscript, it is a little bit, it is a little bit nerve-wracking. And part of the reason I showed the first letter from 1799 was written here is because DeQuincy's hand changes over the course. But there is a sense, like Carol and I have flipped through books looking for DeQuincy letters, and it, I mean, now you can imagine it jumps out. His hand in the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s, I feel pretty confident that it's his hand. But there are things like, there's a letter, I found a letter in the National Library of Switzerland by DeQuincy. And I thought, God, there's a letter in the National Library. And I ordered it, and it came, and it's not by DeQuincy. It's by a guy who signs himself DeQuincy Me, M-E-E. And Wordsworth's son-in-law, Edward Quillinan, said, there's a guy walking around Switzerland claiming he's DeQuincy. And I don't think he's DeQuincy. So, and it isn't DeQuincy. And so I got this letter, I thought, oh, I got a new DeQuincy letter from Switzerland. And then I looked, and it's a forgery. It's not by DeQuincy. And the other example I guess I'll give is that at the end, DeQuincy is always writing to his publishers, I can't possibly get this done. I mean, I need more money, I need more time. You know, when you're writing and you got a deadline, all you can think about is, well, I need more time. I mean, I can't possibly get it done when I said I'd get it done. That's impossible. I need more time, right? And having an opium addiction, DeQuincy uses all the time. I feel terrible. Yep. And he's not lying. He feels terrible because he's taken opium for 4 straight days to give himself the energy to get it half done. And then then he wipes out. And sometimes he says, I've just taken too much laudanum. I mean, I'm just, out of it. I've taken too much, you can imagine the handwriting on that. I'm just out of it. But his daughter Florence, his daughter Florence at the end of the 1850s says, Dad said that stuff all the time. That wasn't true. Dad was like the cuttlefish that, squirted ink into the eyes of his pursuers or the people looking for manuscripts so that he gave himself more time. DeQuincy uses, I mean, it sounds terrible to say because he was genuinely addicted, but he also went, oh, I can't, I'm too sick. And the number of people who meet him and go, he looks emaciated, and in part, he was emaciated, but it also meant that he could say, well, I can't get it done. So when I thought of writing the biography, I sat down with a friend who has worked on DeQuincy's letters, and he's a brilliant DeQuincy scholar. And I said to him, I'm going to write a biography. What's the one thing I should remember every single day? I should never forget this one central fact about DeQuincy. What is it? And Barry looked at me and he said, he lies. So I thought, it's like reading Catcher in the Rye, isn't it? Where Holden Caulfield begins, I'm the greatest liar you ever saw. Well, that's what it's like. So impersonation and falsification is everywhere.
Right. Well, it was wonderful to have you take us on your journey
There you go.
and Carol's journey as well, because I'm sure she was a great help
Nothing
to
happens
you.
without her.
Right.
Nothing happens.
And I particularly enjoyed what is a definition of a letter? All those problems you had. I thought that was extremely interesting. And of course, the importance of letters, particularly for women, so they can have their voice is another thing I think we should recognize. So can we thank Robert Morrison?
Thank you. Thank you very much.